We've often said that Appalachia at the turn of the 20th century resembled the Wild West about as well as the real Wild West. Our story on this episode concerns an Appalachian outlaw who embraced both violence and religion before becoming the last man to face the hangman's noose in Wise County, Virginia. It's another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Wow, Steve, what we're getting ready to talk about, we've talked about before years ago, but this is another chance for us to talk a little bit more about this person, the last hanging in Wise County, and then how close-knit, or at least you could say the community was, because, you know, I was going to tell you immediately right off the bat that, this was like what we've talked about before, like in West Virginia and some of the places where they dressed up and they went to the final hanging and so forth of this gentleman. Well, I can't really say he was a gentleman by any means, but still, it was a big ado then. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I had either one or both my grandfathers, when they were younger, supposedly said that they went to the last hanging in Wise County. And that's who this would be. Well, who we're getting ready to talk about tonight.
Wow, interesting. And when we get back into this toward the end of the podcast and we talk a little bit more about that, there's some other stuff that we can kind of throw in there as well concerning your background and family background with this particular fellow that we're going to talk about.
Yep.
Well, folks, back in the late 1800s, the rugged hills and hollows of Appalachia were home to many a colorful character. Some remembered as heroes, others as villains, and some a bit of both. Men like Doc Marshall Benton Taylor, Tout Hall, and Devil John Wright. Today we're going to tell the story of a man whose life was filled with violence, heartbreak, and a sort of redemption, at least in his own eyes. The man's name was Clifton Branham, and he holds the distinction of being the last man to be hanged in Wise County, Virginia. Born in 1861, according to his own account, Clifton came out into the world on Cabin Branch in Letcher County, Kentucky. His father, John, fought in the Civil War, but it wasn't a glorious tale of battle and victory. You see, John was captured and spent the rest of the war in the harsh confines of Camp Chase, a Union POW camp in Ohio. When he finally made it home, Clifton's mother, Mahalia, and the family had relocated to the area around Elkhorn City, Kentucky. Now, for a while, things were stable, but not for long. Clifton and his father eventually had a falling out, and in a bit of defiance, young Clifton struck out on his own. He braved the winter rain and snow, crossing the mountains to reach his brother's place in Johnson County, Kentucky. And there he found a taste of independence, working to support himself. A man before his time in more ways than one.
Well, Steve, as Clifton grew older, he stayed on the move. His father bought land on top of Cumberland Mountain right along the Kentucky-Virginia border and built himself a house. In the late 1870s, Clifton went to visit him. From there, he wandered over to the south side of the Pound River where he had some other relatives. And that's where he met his cousin, Nancy, or Nanny Branham. It was love at first sight. Now, Nanny's mother wasn't too keen on the idea of her daughter being courted by Clifton. She flat out refused to allow the relationship, reportedly telling him he was, quote, too ill, unquote, and would whip Nancy to death if she dared disobey. Clifton, in a moment of irony, promised he'd never strike Nancy, a promise that would later prove tragically empty. Determined to be together, the young couple ran off. They slipped away when Nanny's mother was distracted and made their way to Wise, Virginia, and got married. With a marriage license in hand, they returned to Kentucky and settled down. In the years that followed, they had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Sadly, they lost one of their daughters at the age of 3, and her death hit Clifton very hard.
Well, grief sent Branham down a darker path. He took up moonshining, cutting a large chestnut tree to make tubs for the shine. When he wasn't cooking mash, he played music, fiddle and banjo, losing himself in mountain tunes and hard living. It seemed Clifton was trying to drown his sorrows in liquor and song. During this time, he fell in with a rough crowd, too. One of his old schoolmates, Rant Smallwood, became his running buddy. Rant eventually bragged to Clifton that he'd been paid $100 and given a Smith & Wesson .38 to kill a man named Clell Adams, which he did. That bond of friendship, however, was short-lived. When Rant confided in Clifton that he was now planning to kill a man named Francisci, a friend of Branham's, the wheels started turning in Clifton's head. You see, Clifton Branham figured that if someone had to stop Rant, it might as well be him. So he made a plan. Armed with a rifle and a .44 caliber cap and ball Remington, he set out. After some failed attempts, he finally made his move. Under the cover of night, he crept around the house where Rant was staying, found a small hole in the wall, and slipped the muzzle of his gun through it. He fired the fatal shot.
Steve, you know what's interesting about that? You
What's
dropped
that?
a surname that shows up in my family tree.
Oh, which one was that?
Franciscus or Francisco.
Okay.
Francisci is what you said, but it very much resembles Franciscus, which is German, or Francisco, and that's where some of my relatives came out of, was they called themselves Francisco, and then this is the first time I've ever heard it called Francisci. Well, anyway, Rant Smallwood slumped to the floor, managing to gasp, "Clifton Branham has killed me," before he died. Rather than stick around, Branham fled over the mountain into Virginia, making his way to the pound. When he heard folks were accusing him of the murder, he denied it, of course, but then he did something, a little bit suspicious. He stocked up on gunpowder and shot at the nearest store and took off again. Okay, well, for a while he bounced from place to place. First to his brother-in-law's house, and then on to Slate Creek in Buchanan County, and eventually to McDowell County, West Virginia, where he spent time with a fellow moonshiner named Mullins. Don't jump to conclusions here. Nothing to do with it, with my moonshiner here. That's a different story. But from there, he moved on to Tazewell County under an assumed name. George Jones? Are you serious, Steve?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. That's the name he used.
I wonder if he's saying White Lightning at the same time. And met, charmed, and fleeced many women while he was there. It was a lawless, nomadic life, and he seemed to thrive in it. But after some time, the heat died down, Rant Smallwood's death was eventually written off, and Clifton returned home, blending back into his old life. For a couple of months, things seemed kind of quiet, until a man named Henry Vanover was killed.
And we'll talk some more about Henry Vanover when we're done with the podcast, too, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, folks who've listened to our podcast for a while might remember us talking about a man named Bad Ira Mullins, the moonshiner who was ambushed and killed in Pound Gap. Well, Ira was mixed in all sorts of trouble, and before his death, he and his wife Lorenza had squatted on land owned by Henry Vanover, who wasn't having any of it. He ordered the Mullins family off his property. Ira, being Ira, didn't take that kindly. According to local lore, he started plotting to get rid of Vanover. And sure enough, on June 18th, 1887, Henry Vanover was shot and killed. The blame fell on Clifton Branham, who is rumored to have been hired to pull the trigger. Though he denied being the actual killer, he did admit to taking some of the blood money. And that was enough for the law. Branham was arrested and put on trial for murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life in the Kentucky State Prison in Frankfort.
While locked away, something surprising happened. Clifton Branham found religion. He started reading the Bible, joined the Sunday school class, and eventually became part of the Royal Christian Brotherhood. Over the next 13 years, he preached behind prison walls, apparently convinced of his own redemption. And in 1901, thanks to the influence of some well-connected people, the governor of Kentucky granted him a conditional pardon. Clifton Branham was a free man once again. So he takes the A train and heads to Norton, Virginia, where his family met him and took him in. And for a brief moment, he seemed content. But old wounds and bitterness were never far beneath the surface. When he visited his estranged wife, Nancy, for the first time in nearly 20 years, their reunion was cold. Nancy wanted him to come home, but he refused. The grief over their daughter's death still simmered in his heart, and he couldn't forgive her for the years they'd lost.
Well, the next day, Clifton visited his daughter's grave, perhaps searching for peace. But that night, Christmas night, he found only more trouble. While celebrating Christmas with some friends, things got just a bit too rowdy for him, and Clifton left, headed back toward the pound, but was soon confronted by a man named Dave Fleming. The two argued, and Clifton pulled his gun. Nancy, who'd come looking for him with their other daughter, stumbled onto the scene just as Clifton fired at Fleming and missed. In the confusion, Nancy believed Clifton had shot their child. In a fit of rage, she screamed, "You have killed my child, you son of a bitch, and I'll have your neck broke for it." Her words cut deep. In a blind fury, Clifton turned the gun on Nancy and shot her dead.
Whoa. Well, once again, Clifton ran. This time he made it to Kentucky, hiding out at a cousin's house. There he fell for a cousin's daughter, Haley. The trouble wasn't over. He got tangled in a feud between his cousin and the Moore family. Hired to kill Anderson Moore, Clifton did the job, then burned Moore's property. Clifton and Haley planned to escape Appalachia by heading to Michigan. They made it as far as the Big Sandy River, but were captured. Clifton was returned to Wise County to stand trial for Nancy's murder.
After his trial in 1903, Judge W.S. Matthews found him guilty of first-degree murder. At his sentencing, Judge Matthews told Branham, and I quote, "You're a mean man, Branham. You're dangerous to society. You've killed 3 men and your wife. On next Friday, September 25th, 1903, you'll hang by the neck until you're dead." On that day, Clifton Branham was hanged, the last man to meet that fate in Wise County. He addressed a crowd of 4,000 on the courthouse lawn shortly before he was led up to the gallows. There, he dramatically told them why he'd killed his wife, and then asked if anyone there would have done as he did. And 500 hands immediately went up. As he stood on the gallows, he played "In the Sweet By and By" on his guitar before the hood was placed over his head. After a moment of prayer, Branham stepped into eternity, becoming the last man hanged in Wise County, Virginia. And Rod, you have some personal connections to this, do you not?
Too much. Too many connections in this. One, the Vanover family, Henry Vanover. It's distant relatives, but my mother, her mom, was originally a Vanover. And so that's part of it. You mentioned Dave Fleming in there. Fleming's part of that whole concept too, because we've talked about the Pridemore Fleming and the James Sherman Mullins deal that happened in downtown Clintwood. There's a connection there. Yes, Bad Ira Mullins, kin to, I believe, going back there, Counterfeiting Saul, there in relation with him. Also related to my great-great-grandfather, Brandy Jack, or Andrew Jackson Mullins. And so all of this was really just like a tight-knit, sort of close, sort of family thing. I mean, it was like families knew families, and they knew what they could do or they knew what they wouldn't do, one way or the other. And this is what took place. And, you know, and to drop another one here too, my great-great-grandfather also, John Vint Bentley, was the one that described in detail the results of the event at Killing Rock, and that was the murder, and talked about how the people were shot, how their bodies were, and so forth. And he came up with 2 different names other than Red Fox when the supposed killing took place, and he accused 2 other people. He himself was a how can we say this, a constable. That was back in the days that they used to call them constables. But neither man ever saw the light of day when it came to a trial. So, you know, it was one of those things of if you knew somebody would get you off of it or something else. But, you know, what is so coincidental about this? I mentioned it at the beginning of it, and I'm talking about grandfathers going to see the last hanging in Wise County. You know, what's so funny about this is that it's almost like Doc Taylor and Clifton Branham, to a certain degree, used that last little bit of freedom to address religion, and hoping one way or another it was going to get them over the other side, or In Doc Taylor's case, the rumor has get him to Missouri. Who knows how that all takes place. But it's just an interesting story. And I'd always heard of Clifton Branham. I think we've also talked about a man at one time or another, Tandy Branham. There's just, this family, all of these families were just interconnected one way or the other. And, if you made one mad, one was going to get back at you one way or the other. And, sometimes it didn't make any difference if one had got you or not. If it was just you were up to meanness, well, you just clearly did something to be mean out of it till you could get your money or whatever it was it took.
Well, there's a whole series of people from eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia that are either outlaws, bad men, or tough guys. And it's everywhere from Devil John Wright to Tout Hall to Clifton Branham to a lot of these feudists that were over in Kentucky and Virginia. Clifton Branham just happened to be one of those really tough guys and bad guys that met his end at the end of a rope. And a very tragic story.
And this is interesting too. I wonder if, I don't know if you came across it or anything, and I don't know if I've ever came across it. Was he hanged with open gallows as opposed to Doc Taylor that time? Doc Taylor was enclosed. Nobody saw him actually be hanged or anything, but here's Clifton Branham, the last hanging. I would say probably it was out in the open for everybody to see.
I'm thinking, and just thinking, I did not, specifically look for that, but I'm thinking that there is a picture of him going up on the gallows, but I can't swear to that. So that would indicate that if that's the case, it was an open hanging that people could watch. But I can't say yes it was and no it wasn't. I do know that Doc Taylor was not out in the open. I think they had him closed off, but Clifton Branham, I'm not so sure.
Well, Doc Taylor made his address of his sermon from a window till everybody could see him. But then at that point, he was taken down to the gallows, and nobody could see anything about it. And so there's another story for another day of whatever happened to Doc Taylor. But, again, this was a big deal. And prior to us recording, I found out from my mother-in-law, of all things, she has a picture somewhere of some of the family dressed up, nice, clothes and everything. And supposedly they're going to the last hanging in Wise County. And that would be Clifton Branham. So,
wow, cool.
Yeah. Neat.
Well, folks, that is a very interesting story. The story of Clifton Branham, man whose life was a tragic tale of love, violence, and redemption. One of the stories of Appalachia. Now, you can subscribe to our stories at Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app. We're also over on YouTube, so go on over there and click that subscribe button, leave us a comment, and give us a thumbs up too. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.